In the beginning, it all looked peaceful. The Nile shimmered in the early light, stretching like a long ribbon through the desert. Birds circled lazily in the sky. Palm trees swayed, and in the distance, the tall, pointed shape of a pyramid cast a shadow that swallowed the sand. It was beautiful. It was ancient, and for those on the outside looking in, ancient Egypt seemed like a land of magic and gold, of kings and gods, of mystery and perfection. But the truth was far from that perfect image. Life in ancient Egypt, for most people, was brutal, quietly brutal, slowly grinding. The kind of hard life that didn't come with battles and swords, but with heat, hunger, sickness, and silence. If you were born poor in ancient Egypt, you likely stayed poor. You'd wake up not to a rooster's crow, but to the sun beating on your face through thin, thatched roofing. Your mouth would already feel dry. Your body would already ache. You might be 6 years old, or 9, old enough to carry water jugs, scrub mud floors, or help your father in the fields. You didn't go to school. You didn't play much either. The Nile might have given you fish and crops, but it also brought crocodiles, floods, and disease. The days were long. The sun was unforgiving. And worst of all, nobody asked how you were feeling. That wasn't a thing. You just did your work, and you survived. This is not a story about pharaohs. Not really. They had their stories carved in stone, their names etched in gold. But the ones who really built Egypt, they didn't leave behind temples or scrolls. They left behind worn bones, broken teeth, and quiet suffering. The laborers, the farmers, the slaves and servants, the young girls who ground grain until their fingers bled, the old men who collapsed under stone bricks, the women who died in childbirth, and the children who didn't live long enough to learn to speak. This is their story, a human story. Imagine being born in a house made of mud brick. It crumbles during floods and bakes during drought. There's no plumbing, no soap, no medicine that works. If your little brother catches a fever, your parents pray. Maybe they mix herbs. Maybe they offer a sacrifice. But most of the time, they just wait and hope. Disease was everywhere. Tooth decay was so common that even teenagers walked around with missing teeth. Sand blew in with every breath of wind, wearing down enamel, filling lungs, infecting wounds. The hot, dry air didn't help much, either. It dried your skin. It cracked your heels. And the minute you got a cut, even a small one, it could get infected, and that was that. Still, life kept going. People married young. Girls as early as 12, boys a little older. But there was no wedding dress, no big party for most. It was practical. You had kids because you needed help, because life was short, because death was never far. And when babies came, they came into the world without guarantees. Infant mortality was high. Many children never made it past their first year. The lucky ones who did, they were expected to start working almost immediately. Childhood, as we think of it, barely existed. There were no toys, no time for games. Just work. Even your name didn't belong to you in the way we think of it. Names carried meaning, sometimes blessings, sometimes burdens. A name could mark you as property, as someone owned. Many laborers were little more than tools to the people who ruled. Their backs bent under the sun, lifting bricks for pyramids or dragging stones for tombs they would never be allowed to enter. And when they died, there were no monuments, no offerings, maybe just a shallow grave in the sand, quickly forgotten. The ruling class, the priests, scribes, nobles, and pharaohs, they lived differently. Their homes were bigger, cooler, cleaner. They had servants, often many of them. They ate bread made with sifted flour. They wore linen that didn't scratch. But even they weren't spared from the harshness of life. There were no cures for infections, no way to treat most illnesses. A toothache could turn deadly. A cut on your leg might mean amputation. Even the royals often died young, riddled with disease, their bodies later examined and found full of bone issues, spinal damage, and rotted teeth. But there was more than physical pain. There was the pressure of the gods, the fear of not pleasing them. Religion wasn't a choice. It was a system of rules and rituals that governed every single thing. If your crops failed, it was because you had sinned. If your child died, maybe the gods were angry. Life was full of omens, curses, dreams that had to be interpreted. Every action had meaning. Every misstep might doom your soul to be devoured in the afterlife by a monster with the head of a crocodile and the body of a lion. People were obsessed with death, but not because they loved it, because it terrified them. You spent your life preparing for it. You hoped someone would afford to embalm you, wrap your body, say the right prayers, place the right amulets, because if not, you were doomed to wander, lost and voiceless forever. And for those who didn't have money, they got a quick burial. No fancy tomb, no eternal rest. But perhaps the hardest part of living in ancient Egypt wasn't death. It was the silence around suffering. People didn't complain. They couldn't. Complaining didn't change anything. The sun still rose. The Nile still flooded. Your master still called your name. And so people suffered in silence. They endured. And the few moments of joy, a good harvest, a new child, a festival, those were held onto tightly. Like rare gifts, like small pieces of heaven in a life that otherwise felt endlessly hard. So yes, ancient Egypt gave us pyramids and gods and golden coffins. But it also gave us blistered hands, burned skin, hungry stomachs, and quiet pain. It gave us stories of survival that never made it onto papyrus. And somewhere in that dust, buried between the myths and the glory, are the real people, the ones who didn't wear crowns, but who held this great civilization on their backs. The ones who whispered their prayers under the stars, who bled in the fields, who died unnamed. And yet, there's still more to tell. Because in the shadow of all this hardship, something strange happened. Something that historians still puzzle over. A document, a letter, really was found. Not from a king, not from a noble, but from a man, just a man. One who worked, one who lived among the ordinary. And what he wrote might change the way we think about ancient Egypt forever. But before we get to that, you need to understand what it cost to even write something in those days. Ink, time, risk. Why would a man with no wealth or power write a letter that he knew might never be read? Why would he hide it? And more importantly, who was he writing to? We're about to find out. But first, let's go back. Back to the dust. Back to the noise. Back to a day that started like any other, with a rising sun, a sore back, and a single choice to speak or stay silent. He woke before the sun. That wasn't unusual. Most people in his village did. But on this day, the stillness felt different. The wind hadn't yet picked up, so the air was heavy and unmoving. It pressed against his chest as he rose from the thin mat of woven reeds he called a bed. His name was Minnie, and he was 31 years old. That was old by the standards of his time. Most men didn't live that long. His back hurt every morning. His fingers were crooked from years of hauling mud bricks, his eyes always squinting from too much sun and too little shade. He slipped out quietly, not wanting to wake his wife or his youngest daughter who lay curled beside her mother. The baby was finally sleeping, and sleep was precious. Outside, the sky was a dull purple. Stars still lingered, and the air held a hint of coolness. The last breath of night before the heat returned to rule over the land. Minnie walked to the edge of the compound. The goats were stirring. One bleated softly. He knelt and dipped his hands in the water jar. The clay was cool. He splashed his face, then stood still. He didn't have long. The overseers would arrive soon. The gang leaders would shout his name. There was grain to crush, baskets to haul, walls to reinforce. But something inside him didn't want to go yet. Not just yet. He pulled a folded scrap of papyrus from beneath a loose stone by the doorway. He had kept it hidden for weeks. The ink had faded a little. The edges had curled. But the words were still clear. They were his. Every one of them. Written slowly, painfully, after long hours spent watching the scribes at work and copying their forms with stolen bits of charcoal and crushed berry juice. He wasn't supposed to know how to write. That skill belonged to another world. One with clean hands and soft linens. But Minnie had learned, quietly, secretly, because he needed to say something that he couldn't trust to memory, something that needed to live beyond his own breath. The letter wasn't addressed to anyone by name. It began simply, to the one who finds this. Minnie had written it not because he thought it would change anything, not because he expected rescue, but because he wanted someone, someday, to understand. to know what it really meant to live as he did, to struggle and to love, to serve and to ache, to dream, even when dreaming was dangerous. He wrote about his work, about the years spent hauling stones for tombs that weren't his, about the cruel foreman with a whip always in hand, about the cracked skin on his heels, the dust in his throat, the way his arms never stopped trembling after long days. He wrote about the food, flatbread so dry it scratched the roof of his mouth, lentils boiled until they were barely more than paste, and the water, always warm, sometimes murky, never enough. But he also wrote about his daughter. She was 6. Her name was ISI. She was smart and faster than the other children. She liked to hum when she worked. Sometimes, she made up little songs and sang them while sweeping the house. She had eyes like her mother's, sharp and watchful. She once asked why the sky changed color in the evening, and Minnie had no answer. He promised himself then that one day he would learn just to tell her. But he hadn't yet, and he wrote about fear. Not just the fear of punishment or sickness, but the quiet fear. The fear of being forgotten, of living and dying without matching, of being just another name lost to the sand. That was what haunted him. That was why he wrote. As he stared at the letter now, that same fear returned. What if no one ever found it? What if it just crumbled, eaten by insects or buried by wind? What if his words meant nothing? He closed his eyes, not in prayer. He'd done enough of that already. The gods didn't listen to men like him, at least not the ones with empty hands. From down the road, he could hear the familiar sound of wooden sandals on stone. The overseers were coming. He had minutes, maybe less. He tucked the letter back under the stone, smoothed the dirt, and turned toward the rising sun. By the time the others were gathering in the square, many had already joined the line. Faces young and old, some already sweating. No one spoke unless they had to. Eyes pointed down, posture straight. The wrong look could get you whipped. The wrong word could get you more than that. Today's task was reinforcing a wall that had cracked near the grain storehouse. It wasn't glamorous work, not that any of it ever was, but it was hard. The kind of work that pulled at the muscles in your lower back and made your vision blur in the heat. Many grabbed a basket of mud and trudged toward the site. Hours passed. Time meant little during labor. The sun moved, shadows shifted, but the work stayed the same. Lift, carry, slap, spread, repeat. The foreman shouted once when someone dropped a tool. Many didn't look up. He kept going. His hands were slick. His feet slipped in the soft earth. But he kept going. At midday, they got a break. 10 minutes. Just enough time to drink. Maybe stretch. Some leaned against walls. Some crouched in the shade. Many sat on a rock and stared out at the fields beyond the buildings. The papyrus swayed gently in the breeze. The Nile was too far to see, but he could feel its presence. Always near, always watching. He wondered, again, what would happen to his letter, if it would matter, if anyone, years or centuries from now, might one day read it and see him not as a slave or a laborer, but as a man. Then the break ended, and the shouts came, and the rhythm of suffering resumed. That night, he returned home slower than usual. His daughter ran to meet him. Her smile, missing 2 teeth, was like sunlight after a storm. She tugged his hand, eager to show him something she'd drawn in the dirt with a stick. A crocodile, maybe, or a bird. It didn't matter. He smiled, though every muscle in his face fought against it. He picked her up, just for a second, and held her close. She giggled. The sound filled the silence around them. Later, after dinner, after ISI had fallen asleep again, Minnie stepped outside. The stars were bright now. The wind had returned. And for the first time in days, he let himself cry. Just a little, quietly. No one saw. No one needed to. He knelt by the stone again, reached under, pulled the letter out. He didn't add to it. Not this time. But he read it. Every word. Slowly. Carefully. Then he rolled it back up, tied it with a thread of dried papyrus, and sealed it inside a small clay pot. He buried it deeper than before, near the edge of the wall, covered it with sand and rock. It was safe now, as safe as it could be. But even Minnie didn't know, couldn't have known, that centuries later, long after his bones had turned to dust, someone would find it. A scholar, in a forgotten dig site, while searching for temple fragments. A pot, cracked but intact. And inside, the voice of a man who should have disappeared, but didn't. And what that letter revealed, it didn't just rewrite history. It forced the world to reckon with what had been lost and what still remained hidden beneath the sands. But that part of the story hasn't come yet. Not yet. Morning returned like it always did, slow, golden, and unbothered by the weight of human struggle. But this day felt heavier. Minnie's joints ached more than usual. His stomach turned at the thought of flatbread, and even his daughter's cheerful humming couldn't lift the fog hanging behind his eyes. Something had changed. He couldn't name it, but it was there, like a warning carried on the wind. He sat outside their small home, his elbows resting on his knees. Flies circled lazily. A neighbor passed by with a bundle of reeds on her back, nodding without stopping. Another man coughed violently as he limped down the path, his bare foot swollen and cracked. Life went on, quietly, painfully, and without pause. By mid-morning, the overseers had arrived, barking orders. They needed hands to assist with a royal shipment. Food, tools, and ceremonial goods bound for one of the temples further south. Many didn't argue. No one did. Even if your back was breaking, you worked. Even if your skin was sunburnt and bleeding, you worked. Because the alternative wasn't rest, it was punishment. The loading area was chaotic. Donkeys brayed, carts creaked, and men shuffled in line to receive their orders. Minnie was assigned to the papyrus bundles and clay jars. The bundles were light. The jars were not. Each one had to be lifted with care, set down without breaking, and secured tightly with woven rope. He did his work with the precision of someone who'd done it for years. Not fast, not slow, just steady. But while he worked, his mind kept drifting. To the letter, to the pot buried near his wall. What if someone from the village discovered it? What if a stray dog or a curious child knocked over the stone? The thought unsettled him more than the sun or the shouting. He had risked a lot writing it. Not just his time, not just the stolen ink, but something deeper. His dignity, his truth. That letter carried everything he couldn't say out loud. He remembered one line he had written, asterisk, I was not born to build monuments, yet I carry stones for them. Asterisk, he had thought that line over for days before he wrote it down. It still echoed in his chest. Suddenly, a loud crash broke his thoughts. One of the clay jars had slipped from a cart and shattered across the stones. A white cloud of flour blew into the air. The foreman rushed over, red-faced, yelling. Two boys nearby were blamed. They dropped to their knees, heads low, repeating apologies. Many watched but said nothing. He knew better. Even a well-meaning word could turn a whip toward your own back. By the time the sun reached its highest point, Minnie's hands were blistered. His tunic clung to him, soaked in sweat. Lunch was a half loaf and a gulp of water, eaten sitting on a broken crate beneath the thin shadow of a fig tree. The noise of the village faded for a moment. The breeze touched his face, and for just a heartbeat, he allowed himself to think of a world where things were different, where the poor were seen, where a man's voice wasn't measured by his sandals or the color of his linen. But he knew better than to dream like that for too long. Back home that evening, ISI met him with more drawings in the dirt. This time, she had made a little story. A woman riding a crocodile, a snake wearing a crown, a sun that cried, and a moon that laughed. He smiled, not because he understood it, but because she did. Her world still had room for wonder, for nonsense, for joy. And that meant something. As they ate their evening meal, lentils again, with a pinch of herbs, his wife asked quietly, "Are you all right?" He nodded, but she saw it in his eyes. The worry, the weight, the secret. Later, when ISI was asleep and the house had gone quiet, she asked again, "You've buried something, haven't you?" He looked at her, startled. "What do you mean?" "I saw you, the night before last, at the wall, digging." Her voice was calm, not accusing. He hesitated. "It's just a letter." She waited. He looked down. "I wanted someone, someday, to know we were here. Not just the kings, not just the gods. Us." She nodded. "Will it make a difference?" "I don't know," he said, "but I had to try." There was silence for a moment. Then she reached over and took his hand. Then let it be. He didn't cry, but his throat tightened. and he blinked too fast. Sometimes that was all the permission he needed to keep going. That night, sleep didn't come easily. The wind howled outside. Dust swept under the door. Somewhere in the village, a baby cried. Somewhere else, a man shouted. But inside their small home, Minnie lay still, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the words he'd written. Would they survive? Would anyone care? He dreamed, briefly, of sandstorms and stone tablets, of his daughter standing in front of a crowd, reading his words aloud to people he didn't recognize. They wore strange clothes. They spoke strange tongues. But they listened, and that gave him peace. He awoke just before dawn. But this morning was different. There was commotion in the square. A stranger had arrived. Not just a traveler or a merchant, someone official. A scribe, wearing fine linen, holding scrolls marked with red ink. His sandals were clean. His skin was pale. People whispered, why was a royal scribe here, in a village of workers and farmers? Many kept his distance, but he watched. The scribe spoke to the foreman, pointed at various structures, took notes. He asked questions, too many, about the houses, the fields, the people. He wasn't just passing through. He was investigating. By midday, the scribe had asked to see the storage areas near Minnie's home. Close, dangerously close, to the spot where the letter was buried. Minnie's stomach twisted. His hands were cold despite the heat. What if the ground was disturbed? What if someone saw the pot, cracked it open, read the letter, and realized it wasn't written by an authorized scribe? That would mean punishment. Maybe worse. He walked the long way home. He passed the alley slowly. The stone near the wall was still there. No one had touched it. Not yet. That night, after his daughter fell asleep and his wife whispered a prayer to the sky, Minnie stood near the wall, not touching anything, just standing, listening. The village had gone quiet, but in that silence was a decision. Should he move the letter? Destroy it? Hide it somewhere farther away? Or should he leave it and trust that maybe, just maybe, the right person would find it? He didn't know the answer, but deep down, something told him the story is not finished yet, and tomorrow would bring the turning point. The next morning brought no answers, only more dust and heat. The royal scribe hadn't left. He was staying in a shaded tent at the edge of the village, guarded by 2 soldiers and surrounded by scrolls. No one knew exactly what he wanted, but people had theories. Some said a theft had occurred at the temple, grain stolen, tools missing. Others believed he was there to assess labor, to see who was strong enough to be sent north to the quarries. A few whispered that he was looking for something or someone. Many tried not to listen, but it was hard. Every conversation, every glance, every shuffle of feet in the sand carried weight. And his mind, always moving, always afraid, couldn't let go of one thought. What if the letter was discovered? What if the scribe knew someone had written without permission? Writing was sacred. Words were power. In Egypt, only a select few had the right to record. Priests, scribes, the noble born. A poor man putting ink to papyrus was more than unusual. It was forbidden, dangerous, unthinkable. Still, he went to work as usual. His arms ached from the previous day, but his movements were practiced. He built walls without thinking. He spoke little. He kept his eyes down, but he could feel it, that strange pull in the air, like a storm waiting just beyond the horizon. During the midday break, he sat under the same fig tree, alone. He didn't eat much, just chewed slowly and stared at the sky. A hawk circled far above. A few children laughed somewhere in the distance, but even that felt distant, fragile. Then suddenly footsteps. He looked up. It was the scribe. The man was younger than many expected, maybe 25. His clothes were pale and spotless, his face clean-shaven. He didn't look like someone who had ever lifted bricks or bent over rows of barley. But his eyes were sharp, curious, watchful. He sat down without asking. "You're Minnie," he said plainly. Minnie's chest tightened. "Yes, master." "You live near the grain stores?" "Yes." "You have a wife, a daughter?" "ISI." Minnie hesitated. "Yes." The scribe unrolled a scroll and read something silently. His brow furrowed, and for a long moment he didn't speak. "I found something this morning," he finally said. "Near a wall. A small pot." Minnie's stomach flipped. His mouth went dry. His tongue felt heavy. The scribe looked at him. It was buried deep, sealed. I nearly didn't open it. Many didn't speak. He couldn't. There was a letter inside, the scribe continued, written in a careful hand, not trained but practiced. It spoke of labor, of fear, of dreams. He paused. Did you write it? Many didn't answer. The scribe tilted his head. You used stolen ink, homemade pigments. You mimicked the writing of the temple boys. You hid it well, but you still wanted it to be found. Still no answer. I should report it, the scribe said. Forgery, unauthorized writing. The penalty is not light. Many nodded slowly, still silent. There was no use in lying. It was done, but I didn't report it, the scribe said. His voice had softened. Not yet. Many looked up, surprised. Do you know why? The scribe asked. Many shook his head. Because it moved me, he said. It made me feel something I haven't felt since I first began writing. That words can still matter. That truth still has weight. Many blinked. The scribe leaned forward. You spoke honestly. Simply. No tricks. No flowery phrases. Just pain, and beauty, and life. He paused again. You reminded me why we write in the first place. Many stared at him, unsure what to say. I want to help you, the scribe said. But I must be careful. If anyone finds out what I've read, or where I found it, we'll both be punished. Many swallowed. Why would you help me? The scribe gave a faint smile. Because I believe your voice deserves to survive. The two men sat in silence for a while. Nothing needed to be said. In that still moment, something ancient passed between them. Not just respect, not just understanding, but the realization that they were both, in their own way, outsiders. Bound by rules they didn't make. Searching for something that didn't yet exist. Eventually, the scribe stood. I'll hide the letter. Take it north with me. Store it among my own records. No one will find it for a long time. Maybe not in my lifetime. But one day, someone will read it again. Many's voice finally returned, barely above a whisper. Thank you. The scribe nodded, then turned to leave. But after a few steps, he looked back. Write more, he said. When you can. When it's safe. Let your daughter learn. Teach her the shapes. The sounds. Let her carry it too. Then he was gone. Many sat still for a long time. The sun burning above, the shadows shrinking at his feet. For the first time in weeks, his body didn't feel so heavy. His hands still ached. His back still throbbed. But inside, a small flame had been lit, one that even the wind couldn't touch. That night, after everyone had fallen asleep, Many lit a tiny oil lamp and pulled out a fresh piece of scrap papyrus. It was wrinkled and uneven, but it would do. He dipped his makeshift brush in a crushed soot and began to write. Today, someone listened. He paused. Asterisk, and tomorrow. I will write again, asterisk. He smiled to himself. Then he carefully folded the sheet, hid it deep within a crack in the wall, and blew out the lamp. Somewhere beyond the village, the scribe rode north under the stars, the pot with Minnie's letter tucked beneath his robes. Neither of them knew what the future would hold. Neither of them would live to see what became of those words. But in that fragile, uncertain moment, in the heat and dust and silence of ancient Egypt, something had shifted. A seed had been planted, and long after the pyramids had crumbled and the gods had fallen silent, that seed would wait. Buried, patient, ready. The next few days passed quietly, almost too quietly. Many noticed the change in the air. People in the village spoke less. They kept their heads low and didn't linger after work. The presence of the royal scribe, even though he was now gone, had left something behind, a kind of tension that everyone felt but no one dare mention. It hung in the corners of their homes, in the stillness of the evening meals, in the way the children stopped playing so loudly near the walls. Many said nothing about the letter, not even to his wife. Not again. The moment he shared with the scribe had felt like a passing dream, the kind you're scared to speak of because you're not sure it really happened. But deep inside, he felt something had changed. Not out there, not in the eyes of the world, but in him. He was still a laborer, still poor, still unknown. But now he was also something else, someone who had dared to write, to speak, to leave a mark. He began watching people differently, not just with tired eyes, but with a kind of quiet curiosity. The old man who sharpened tools in the shade. How many sons had he buried? The woman who weaved baskets by the river. What did she dream about when she was a girl? The boy missing 2 fingers who still ran like the wind through the narrow paths. How had he survived whatever took them? Every person in the village had a story, but most of them would never be told. That was the way of things. The kings had monuments. The scribes had scrolls. The gods had temples. But the people, the ones who lived in the mud and walked barefoot through the heat, they had only the silence. Still, something gnawed at Minnie. A question he couldn't shake. Why had the scribe really come? He said he found the letter. But what if that wasn't the whole truth? What if someone had told him? What if someone had seen Minnie at the wall and reported it? He tried to let go of the thought, but it clung to him. Every time someone looked at him for a moment too long, his chest tightened. Every time a neighbor went quiet when he passed, he wondered if they knew. And worst of all, he didn't know who he could trust. Even at home, he became more cautious. When he wrote, and he did write, nearly every night, he did it with one ear tuned to every sound outside. A footstep, a cough, a knock. His wife noticed. She didn't press him, but he saw the worry in her face. In the way she held ISI closer at night. In the way she locked the door with an extra stone. Then, on the 4th day, something strange happened. Just before dusk, as the light turned soft and orange and the air cooled for the first time all day, Minnie heard a noise outside. Not loud, but deliberate. A hand brushing the wall. A breath held too long. He stepped outside slowly, his fingers tightening around the edge of the doorframe. There was a figure near the corner of his house. Hooded. Slim. Not moving. Minnie's heart pounded. "Who's there?" he said, voice low but firm. The figure stepped forward, just enough to be seen in the fading light. It was a boy, maybe 14, maybe younger. He looked nervous. His eyes were wide, darting left and right. Minnie didn't recognize him. The boy held something in his hand, a folded piece of papyrus. He didn't speak, just extended it toward Minnie with a trembling arm. Minnie took it. Before he could say a word, the boy turned and ran into the darkness, bare feet slapping softly against the ground, disappearing around the corner and into the shadows. Minnie stood frozen for a moment. Then he stepped inside, closed the door, and unrolled the papyrus. There were only a few lines. The handwriting was neat, measured, too clean for a villager. It had to be the scribe. "Minnie, asterisk, they're looking for something else. I did not tell them about you, but others know. Be careful who sees you write. Burn what you must. Hide what you can. And remember, someone is listening. Asterisk." There was no name, no mark, just a message. Minnie sat down, staring at the words. The shadows flickered across the walls, dancing with the light of the small lamp. His wife came in, carrying ISI on her hip, and paused when she saw his face. "Is it bad?" she asked. He handed her the note. She read it slowly, then nodded. "They won't stop," she said. "Not once they think there's something hidden." Minnie knew she was right. The scribe had said the letter moved him, but clearly someone else had seen it or seen him. And now, it wasn't just about one pot. It was about what else might be hidden. If one laborer could write, what else might the village be hiding? And suddenly, it wasn't just about him anymore. He thought of the boy. Who was he? Why had he come? Did he even know what he was delivering? And the others, the ones who knew. How many were there? Did someone follow him? Had someone read the new writings he'd tucked in the wall? He wanted to stop, to burn it all, as the note said, to throw the ink into the Nile and forget it ever happened. But he couldn't. The words had become part of him now, like breath, like memory. That night, he didn't write. He just sat in the dark, holding ISI as she slept, listening, thinking, wondering. The next morning, the sun rose without mercy. The work resumed, the shouting continued, and the village, on the surface, returned to normal. But beneath that, beneath the sweat and the silence and the dust, something stirred. Because Minnie wasn't the only one who had written something they weren't supposed to. He wasn't the only one with questions, or secrets, or stories. And far away, deeper in the kingdom, someone else, someone with more power, had also read his letter. And they were coming. It didn't take long for the sun to rise again over the sands. But this new day brought no relief. Only more dust, more sweat, and the same gnawing hunger that had become normal. Down by the riverbanks, where the Nile carved a rare line of life into the landscape, workers gathered even before the sky had turned gold. Barefoot and sore from yesterday's labor, they didn't speak much. Words felt like a luxury when your throat was dry and your belly empty. The air smelled of damp mud and human effort, and the sounds of wooden tools scraping rock filled the silence long before any priest began a morning chant. One of the workers, a boy no older than 13, knelt beside a cracked clay jug, dipping his hands into the water. His name was Hapu. His fingers were raw from hauling bricks all week, and his arms trembled every time he lifted a tool. But he had no time to complain, and no one to complain to. His father had been buried just a few days earlier, dropped into the dirt like a broken tool no longer useful. Heat stroke, they said. But Hapu had seen how long the man had gone without rest, how he'd collapsed the day before from the weight of limestone blocks pulled by rope and shouted orders. Everyone had seen it. No one had said a word. Nearby, another man was tying a worn strip of linen around his foot to replace a missing sandal. His name was Minna, older than most here and quieter too. He had once worked inside the temple, carving sacred images into stone, work that earned him more bread and less sun. But one small mistake had ruined all that. He had chiseled the wrong symbol on a priest's monument, and though he begged forgiveness, the punishment was swift. He was cast out of the artisan's quarter and made to break stones instead of shape them. His hands, once praised for their skill, were now too swollen to even hold a chisel. Every person in that work gang had a story like that, a reason they ended up where they were. A wrong word, a sick child, a missed quota. And once you fell, the climb back up was impossible. Not because you lacked skill, but because the system didn't allow it. Life in ancient Egypt had rules, yes, but not the kind that protected you. They were rules that protected the ones already at the top. The scribes, the priests, the foremen with their sticks and endless scrolls. And sometimes, even they weren't safe. Back in the heart of the city, behind tall, whitewashed walls and shaded courtyards, a woman named Nedjeret stood silently beside her husband. He was a scribe, a man who read and wrote for the temple, and one of the few who could afford honey with his barley cakes. Nedjeret had married him young, before his status had risen. She remembered the early years, when they had shared a single room and eaten boiled onions 3 nights in a row. But things had changed quickly. Her husband was clever with numbers, quiet with his thoughts, and patient in his ambition. Now they lived near the temple, and she wore necklaces made of lapis and carnelian. But even here, in the city's safe belly, there was tension. Her husband had not spoken of it directly, but Nedjeret could feel it in the way he paced late at night, muttering about scrolls and grain taxes. Rumors had started to circulate, something about the priests underreporting the stores of wheat. If true, someone would pay. And when people of rank get nervous, they tend to pass their fear downward. She looked out through the shutters toward the street below. 2 boys were arguing over a piece of fruit. One of them had no shirt, and the other's ribs poked out from under his skin. Life here might seem better, she thought, but it was just as brutal in its own quiet way. Comfort was temporary. A bad season, a failed harvest, or the anger of a superior could reduce anyone to nothing. At that very moment, far from the comfort of her courtyard, Hapu was hauling a load of bricks toward a construction ramp. The pyramid in the distance, still unfinished, looked closer every day, but the work never seemed to end. He had heard whispers from older workers that it might never be completed. That pharaoh might die before it was done. And if that happened, everything would stop. The gods would be angry. The priests would demand atonement. And the workers, like him, might be buried beneath what they had spent years building. He wiped the sweat from his brow, his thoughts wandering. He missed his mother, who had died when he was small. He remembered her songs, soft ones about green fields and cowbells. There were no green fields out here, just stone, commands, and the beat of the sun. Nearby, Minna coughed violently. Dust had coated his lungs again. The overseer, a man with a thick stick and a sour mouth, looked over but said nothing. Minna waved him off and kept working. Any pause could be punished. He knew a boy once, barely 12, who'd been lashed for resting without permission. No one wanted to end up like him. The boy had disappeared a week later. Some said he had run. Others said the foreman buried him under the foundation. At night, the city would cool slightly, but only enough to let you lie in discomfort rather than agony. Workers slept in cramped barracks, shoulder to shoulder, their dreams filled with falling stones and collapsing ramps. Even sleep wasn't free from labor. Many talked in their sleep, shouting, weeping, whispering the names of lost children or forgotten gods. Nedjeret, in her bed of woven flax, couldn't sleep either. Her husband had been gone late again, summoned to speak with temple officials. She heard that same strange name again on his lips, Khonsu, a priest with too much power and a habit of watching people too closely. Something about the temple records being altered. Something about gold. The deeper she thought about it, the more her stomach turned. Her husband was not a brave man. He was smart, but not brave. If he was being pulled into something dangerous, he wouldn't tell her until it was too late. Down in the workers' quarters, Hapu sat on the ground chewing on a piece of dried figure. It was all he had saved from lunch, and he ate it slowly, savoring the tiny burst of sweetness. Minna sat beside him, rubbing his aching knees. "You ever wonder if they'll remember us?" Hapu asked. "Who?" "The ones in the future. The ones who come after us." Minna gave a small, bitter laugh. "They'll remember the stone. Not us. But we built it. They don't remember the hands. Just the names carved above them." The boy fell quiet, staring at the stars. Somewhere out there, maybe in the distant future, someone might walk the halls of the tombs he helped build. Someone might read the names of the kings, admire the columns, and wonder how such a thing was made. But they would never know about Hapu, or Minna, or the boy who disappeared. The world outside the desert would move on. But here, life would remain hard, sun-scorched, and brutal. And yet, something strange was beginning to stir. Out in the desert, beyond where even the Pharaoh's gaze reached, a caravan had stopped in the middle of the night. No torches, no fire, just hushed voices, cloaked figures, and the sound of something being buried. A bundle, wrapped tightly in fine cloth, too fine for a worker. And beside it, something else. A scroll, sealed not with the mark of the temple, but with the symbol of a falcon devouring a snake. Whatever they were hiding wasn't meant to be found. But Hapu, Minna, and even Nedjeret were already closer to it than they knew. And in a land where every breath could be your last, the truth, like a buried tomb, was waiting to rise. The night passed, and with it, any illusion of peace. The air was thick with heat and dust as the long line of laborers made their way back toward the riverbank. Barefoot and silent, they trudged beneath the weight of the day's toil, backs aching, mouths dry, skin darkened and cracked from the relentless sun. One man, Kapa, no older than 30, walked with a limp in his right leg. He hadn't been born to suffer like this. No one had, but choices were few, and survival in ancient Egypt wasn't about fairness. It was about obedience, luck, and endurance. His village had once sat near a stretch of farmland nourished by the Nile's yearly flooding, but recent years had been cruel. The river had not risen as high. Crops had failed. Taxes, however, had not. The scribes came just the same, scrolls and sticks in hand, demanding wheat, fish, and linen that no longer existed. In a world where pharaohs were gods, hunger was not an excuse, it was a sentence. And so, like many others, Kapa was pressed into service. Not as a soldier or a craftsman, but as a laborer, building tombs for the dead while the living wasted away. It was nearing dusk when he reached the tent he shared with 5 others. The wind blew a bit cooler at night, but the sand still clung to everything, skin, cloth, thoughts. A boy no older than 12 sat quietly near the entrance. His name was Baki, orphan when his mother died of fever and his father disappeared into the copper mines of Sinai. Some believe the man was still alive, scraping at the rock face until his hands bled. Others whispered he had collapsed and was thrown into a pit like the rest. Baki never spoke of it. The men around them barely exchanged words as they ate. Their meals were always the same: coarse bread, dried onions, and a hint of fermented fish paste when fortune allowed. Kapa broke off a piece of his loaf and handed it to Baki, who nodded in silent thanks. Even in a world ruled by cruelty and castes, small kindnesses made the difference between losing your mind and holding onto a scrap of your soul. A guard's voice echoed through the camp. Short, sharp commands. There had been talk of another inspection. The overseers had grown paranoid. Tools had gone missing. Rumors of sabotage drifted from tent to tent like smoke. Someone had carved strange symbols into one of the quarry walls. They said it was a curse, a warning that those who disturbed the tombs would suffer. But most knew better. There was no curse, just anger, just people with tired backs and nothing left to lose. The guard entered their tent without waiting for permission. He was tall, dressed in linen and leather, with a bronze dagger slung across his chest. Not because he needed it often, but because fear was more efficient than any weapon. He scanned the faces quickly, eyes pausing on Baki. "You, come with me." Kappa tensed. "He's just a child," he said without thinking. The guard turned his gaze slowly. "Do you wish to take his place?" There was no answer. Kappa dropped his eyes, and Baki rose to his feet. No one spoke as the two disappeared into the twilight. It was always like that, quick, quiet, and brutal. No explanations, no returns. Later that night, as the camp fell into a restless sleep, a low, strange humming carried across the dunes. Not the sound of insects or wind, but something unfamiliar, rhythmic, pulsing. Those who heard it said nothing. In Egypt, strange sounds in the dark were best ignored. But Kappa could not sleep. He sat upright, listening, until the stars began to shift above him and the noise faded into memory. The next morning, Baki was back. He walked into the tent like nothing had happened, though his eyes looked older, his lips more chapped than before. He said nothing, and no one asked. But that silence, thick, unnatural, hung heavy in the air. Kappa watched him closely. The boy moved differently now, more aware of space, of people, of danger, as if he'd glimpsed something that could not be unseen. The day's labor was worse than usual. The sun bore down like fire, and the overseers snapped orders with rising aggression. Someone had carved another symbol. This time, deep within the tomb, they were digging. The priests were furious. Sacred texts were being violated, they said. The dead were being mocked. The workers, of course, were blamed. They were forced to stand in a line while the guards searched their few belongings. Ropes, chisels, water skins. Nothing of use, nothing dangerous. Still, one man was pulled aside. His name was Teddy, a former fisherman from the Delta. No one saw him again. Whispers began to spread. The marks weren't random. They were a language, and Baki was drawing them. Kappa saw it one night. The boy's hand moved across the sand with precision, forming shapes that felt familiar and alien at once. Lines and circles. A serpent biting its own tail. A star within a star. When Kappa stepped closer, Baki quickly smoothed it over with his foot and said nothing. But Kappa had already seen too much. He recognized one of the symbols from the tomb wall, the one that had sparked the priest's outrage. A forbidden sign, they said, the mark of Set, the god of chaos. Why would a child know such things? Why was he still alive? As the days passed, more strange events unfolded. Tools vanished, only to reappear in odd places. One of the priests fell sick after touching the tomb door, his lips turning dark and his breath shallow. A sandstorm blew in from the west, unexpected and fierce, tearing through the sight like a warning. And through it all, Baki remained untouched, unharmed, and unreadable. One night, when the sky was ink black and the moon hid behind clouds, Kappa followed the boy. He trailed him from the tent, across the dunes, toward a broken statue half buried in the earth. There, Baki knelt, whispering in a tongue Kappa could not understand. His hands traced symbols in the dust, and for a moment, the air around him shimmered, not with light, but with heat, like the world was holding its breath. Kappa stepped back, his foot crunching on a shard of pottery. Baki turned, his face calm, but his eyes, they glowed faintly like embers behind glass. "You shouldn't be here," the boy said. Kappa froze. "What are you?" Baki stood, brushing off his tunic. "Just a boy, like you were, before the world broke you." Then he walked past, his steps soft, leaving no trace. Kapot didn't sleep that night, or the night after. His thoughts were a blur of ancient gods, secret symbols, and a boy who had no fear. Something was stirring in the desert. Something old. And Kapot was no longer sure who was building the tomb, or who it was really for. One evening, the overseer announced change. A high priest would be visiting the site to perform a cleansing ritual. The signs were too many, the omens too dark. The pharaoh himself had been alerted. They would be watching. Everyone would be expected to participate. Any resistance would be seen as treason. The workers nodded. But beneath their stillness, tension crackled. That night, Baki came to Kapot's tent. "I need your help," he whispered. Kapot stared at him. "Help with what?" "The tomb. It's not for the pharaoh. It's for something else. Something that should never wake." Kapot's blood ran cold. "You said you were just a boy." "I am. But I remember things I shouldn't. I see things no one else sees. And now it's coming." The sand shifted outside. A gust of wind whistled past the tent, carrying a sound like distant chanting. Kapot stood, unsure whether it was madness or destiny pulling him forward. But either way, he knew there was no turning back. The air in the village had changed. It wasn't just the summer heat rolling in off the desert or the way the Nile water had started to taste a little more bitter. It was something else. Something unspoken. The elders felt it first. They sat in the shade longer, their brows furrowed, even when no one was speaking. The children noticed too. As their games became quieter, their laughter more cautious. It was as if the village itself was holding its breath. Bhikkhu walked the path toward the granary, his sandals dragging across the dry earth. Dust curled around his feet like smoke. In his arms, he carried a sack of barley, one of the few sacks not spoiled by the last flood. The river had risen higher than anyone remembered, drowning the lower fields and washing away the shallow graves in the floodplain. Crops were lost, and worse, bodies had surfaced. The priests had rushed to perform quiet rites, hoping to prevent spirits from roaming, but whispers had already started. The gods were angry. It wasn't a new idea. In ancient Egypt, divine favor was everything. From the moment a child was born, their fate was tied to how well the gods were pleased. A good harvest meant the gods smiled upon the village. A drought meant someone, somewhere, had angered them. And now, with rising waters, dying cattle, and priests who looked over their shoulders too often, suspicion floated like smoke from a fire no one could find. Because family had kept a shrine to Osiris, like most others. But unlike others, because Father, Minif, was once a temple scribe. He had seen what others hadn't. He knew what the priests didn't say out loud, even to each other. Minif used to say, "It's not always the gods who bring curses. Sometimes it's men pretending they can control them." Bhikkhu had never fully understood what that meant. Not until the night his father disappeared. That night, thunder rolled across the desert without a single cloud in the sky. No rain fell. No lightning struck. But the sound came, low, rumbling, and then stopped. When the family awoke the next morning, Minif was gone. No footprints. No sign of struggle. Just his sandals left at the edge of the fields near the irrigation canal. The priest's explanation? The gods had taken him. A cleansing, they called it. But Bhikkhu never believed that. Now, as he arrived at the granary, he saw that the guards were on edge. Their eyes darted toward the shadows. Their grips tightened around their spears. One of them, a boy barely older than Bhikkhu, nodded silently as Bhikkhu passed but didn't smile. No one smiled anymore. Inside, the grain-keeper looked up. He was a thick-shouldered man with rough hands and tired eyes. "You're lucky this barley isn't wet," he said, running his fingers through the sack Bhikkhu dropped at his feet. "Some are bringing in mold. Some are bringing nothing. We kept it stored under the bricks," Bhikkhu said. "My mother made sure the rats didn't get to it." The grain-keeper grunted. "Smart woman. Keep it that way. There's word the Pharaoh's men are coming to count the stores. If they think we're holding back," he didn't finish. He didn't need to. Everyone knew what happened when royal inspectors thought the quotas weren't met. It wasn't just life that was brutal in ancient Egypt. It was fear, not just of the gods or the weather or illness, but of other people, of officials with polished sandals who came down from Memphis or Thebes, asking too many questions taking too much, smiling too little. Taxes weren't just paid in coins. They were paid in grain, cloth, labor, and sometimes in silence. Because stepped back outside, blinking in the harsh sunlight. In the distance, he could hear drums echoing from the temple. Another procession, another offering, another desperate plea for peace. At home, his mother was stitching linen. Her fingers worked fast and tight, like she was sewing away her worry. His younger sister Nisi sat beside her, pretending to play with her doll, but watching their mother's every move. Their dog, Senate, lay under the bench, ears twitching now and then. Was the grain taken? His mother asked without looking up. Yes, Bhikkhu replied. They didn't say anything else. She nodded. Then we say nothing more. But Bhikkhu couldn't stop the thoughts from circling in his mind. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the place where his father's sandals were found. He saw the strange marks in the earth around them, curved like claws, but no animal would have left them like that. He saw the way the priests had walked in a tight circle, chanting under their breath, throwing natron into the air like it would blind anyone who looked too closely. And then there was the new priest, Ramka. He had arrived just days before Menef disappeared, dressed in golden linen and carrying scrolls sealed with the Pharaoh's sigil. He claimed to have studied at Karnak, said he came with blessings from the god Thoth. But Menef didn't trust him. Bhikkhu remembered that clearly. There's something wrong about his silence. Menef had whispered to Bhikkhu once. He watches too much, listens too little. Now Ramka was in charge of all rituals in the village. He even oversaw the burial ceremonies, work that once belonged to the village elders. And he had ordered the people to stop asking questions about Menef's disappearance. He has been taken, Ramka had said in a voice that echoed like stone. That is all. But Bhikkhu needed to know more. The night his father vanished, the household cat, Moet, had scratched at the door all night, yowling and hissing. The next day, the cat was gone too. Some said animals could sense things. Some said they could see things humans weren't meant to. So when the sun dipped low and the last of the light brushed the tops of the date palms, Bhikkhu left his house and slipped quietly toward the edge of the village. He didn't tell his mother. She wouldn't have allowed it. But there was a part of him that needed to see the old temple grounds. The place where the original priests, before Ramka, used to hold secret ceremonies during the old moon. It was said to be haunted now, forbidden. But it was also where Menef had once taken him as a boy, whispering stories of gods who walked like men and men who pretended to be gods. The path was overgrown, the air cooler here. Crickets chirped in low, rhythmic hums, and strange birds called from the trees. Bhikkhu's heart beat louder than his footsteps. He carried only a reed torch and a small carving of Horus his father once gave him. When he reached the edge of the ruins, the air changed again. It wasn't colder, but heavier, as if the space between the trees carried weight. The wind didn't blow here. Nothing moved, not even the insects. The stones were cracked, half swallowed by sand and time. Symbols once carved clean were now faint shadows. He stepped carefully, his torch casting dancing shapes on the broken walls. Then he heard it, whispers. Not loud, not words he could make out, but voices, definitely voices. Bhikkhu froze. He knelt behind a stone pillar, holding his breath, straining to listen. The whispers grew clearer. Two figures stood in the moonlight, not far from him. One wore a priest's robe. The other, a uniform with the Pharaoh's insignia. I told you the boy is watching, the man in the robe whispered. Then let him watch, the official replied. He'll vanish just like his father. Bhikkhu's blood turned to ice. He gripped the carving of Horus so tightly it bit into his palm. The torch flickered. The robed man turned suddenly, eyes sharp. Who's there? Bhikkhu bolted. He didn't look back. He ran until the trees blurred, until his breath came in short, panicked gasps, until his legs felt like they'd give out. He didn't stop until he reached the edge of the irrigation canal, where his father's sandals had been found. There, in the moonlight, something was waiting. Not a person, not a priest, but something. And before he could cry out, the whispering started again. This time, all around him. The Nile kept flowing, slow and steady, like the breath of a land that had seen too much. Each ripple carried the weight of centuries. And beneath that calm surface, life remained brutal, not just for the slaves or peasants, but for anyone without power. The priests, who held the secrets of the gods, whispered omens no one could prove. The scribes, tucked in candlelit corners, etched taxes and curses alike. Even the soldiers who patrolled the borderlands wore masks of fear behind their bronze helmets. It was a world where even a whisper against the wrong man could end with your name scraped off your tomb and your memory erased forever. In a small reed house near the edge of Thebes, a mother wrapped her child in linen, whispering prayers to Sekhmet to keep fevers away. She had seen too many mothers bury their children. The sun gave life, but it also took it mercilessly. Heat cracked the earth, and when the rains didn't come, food vanished. Grain was more valuable than gold. Every harvest brought a gamble, and the gods, if they listened, were cruel with their silence. Kim, now a young man with calloused hands and sharp eyes, moved through this world with quiet observation. He had grown since we last saw him, and so had his fear. He had learned to keep his head down, to bow at the right time, to avoid looking an overseer in the eye. But he also listened when the older farmers muttered about missing food jars, listened when his father said taxes had doubled for no reason. And he noticed things. He noticed how the officials would sometimes arrive at the granaries with empty carts, only to leave them half full, then disappear for days. Something was off. Kim couldn't explain it, not exactly. But he had started staying up at night, watching the shadows along the canal. He had seen strange figures near the priests' storehouses. Not thieves. These men were clean, organized, and fast. They looked like they belonged there. But something in their movements didn't sit right. They didn't walk like men of prayer. They moved like men with secrets. Meanwhile, in the city's limestone halls, high above the noise of the market, Scribe Nedjeru wiped ink from his fingers and stared at the papyrus before him. He had just finished copying the monthly grain inventory, and something was wrong. Again, the numbers didn't line up. The same shipment from the southern fields had been marked twice under two different names. Someone was siphoning resources, and not in small amounts. Nedjeru wasn't a bold man. He wasn't a warrior. But he was smart. And more importantly, he believed in Ma'at, balance, justice, truth. He debated telling the chief accountant. But what if the man wasn't on it? He thought about visiting the temple's high priest, but that, too, was dangerous. If corruption had seeped into the priesthood, then even the god's house wasn't safe. Nedjeru knew stories of scribes who had disappeared for less. Still, he copied the pages and hid the duplicates inside a hollow behind his modest quarters. If anything happened to him, maybe someone else would find them. Elsewhere, along the western cliffs where tombs carved deep into the stone echoed with history, laborers carried heavy stone slabs under the whip. These weren't criminals, not officially. Many were farmers who couldn't pay taxes, or men accused of laziness or insolence. Some were simply poor souls caught in the wrong place. The sun beat down on their backs as they heaved granite blocks into place, building monuments for men who would never look them in the eyes. One man, older, with a crooked shoulder, muttered something under his breath as he passed another slab. A younger laborer heard him. "You speak of the Pharaoh like that. You'll get your tongue cut out," the young man warned. The older man just grinned, a broken-toothed smirk. "Then I'll mumble in the afterlife, too," he said. Behind the humor, there was bitterness. Deep, cold bitterness. This wasn't loyalty. It was fear wearing the mask of respect. Not far from these workers, a tomb painter named Jet carefully traced the face of a nobleman onto the wall of a half-completed burial chamber. His hand shook slightly. He had been ordered to make the man appear more handsome than in life, to soften the chin and widen the eyes. Jet obeyed, but he hated the lie. He had painted his own brother's tomb years ago after a rockfall crushed him during a rush construction for a lesser official. His brother's body had never been fully buried. "Just dumped," Jet had said once to a close friend, as if he were a goat carcass. Now, every brushstroke felt like a betrayal, not to the gods, but to his brother's memory. And Jet had started painting small symbols into the backgrounds of his murals, things only someone like him would notice. A broken spear, a weeping falcon, a god with a hand over its mouth. He didn't know why he did it. Maybe it was defiance. Maybe it was his own private curse. Back in Nile village, Kim's father, Seneb, had begun walking with a limp. The weight of years, hard labor, and stress had caught up to him. He didn't say much anymore. But one evening, while eating stale bread in the dark, he looked at Kim and said, "If you ever find a way to leave this place, don't look back." That night, Kim couldn't sleep. He heard drums from the temple, soft chanting in the distance, and somewhere, someone crying. And then came the summons. A runner from the local magistrate arrived, demanding all able-bodied men from the area for a new construction. No explanation, no payment, just a decree. When Kim and the others arrived, they were marched into a walled site near the edge of the desert. No one knew what it was, but it wasn't a tomb, and it wasn't a temple. There were no gods carved into the walls, no prayers offered, only strange, tightly sealed chambers with no doors, just narrow shafts leading down into the rock. The air inside was unnaturally cold, and the men who oversaw the digging didn't speak much. Their clothes weren't Egyptian. Their tools gleamed like nothing Kim had seen. That night, while the others slept, Kim crept closer to one of the chambers. He peered inside, and what he saw chilled him to the bone. There were markings on the walls, but they weren't hieroglyphs. They weren't any language he had seen before. And worse, there was something buried beneath the floor. Wrapped, yes, but not in linen. It pulsed, slowly, like it was alive. Before Kim could move, a hand grabbed his shoulder. It was one of the foreign overseers. The man didn't speak, just looked at him. A long, silent stare that said, "You saw too much." By morning, the chamber had been sealed. But that wasn't the end of it. That was only the beginning. And while Kim returned to the village, silent, shaken, and unsure of what had just happened, Nedru the scribe stared at a fresh entry in the food inventory and noticed something that made his heart drop. A line of goods meant for Site 37, a site that, according to his maps, didn't exist. And still, the Nile flowed. By now, the air had grown thick with heat and silence. The streets of Wazit, known today as Thebes, shimmered with the weight of the sun pressing down on every roof and crumbling brick wall. Children no longer played near the alleyways by midday, and even the traders had begun pulling back their faded linen awnings. Everyone knew the desert did not show mercy, especially not in this season. But for the poor, those scraping whatever bread they could from the underbelly of the Nile's favor, there was no such thing as rest, even in brutal heat. A woman named Sennet knelt outside her small home with a woven reed basket of dry barley. She was grinding it between two stones, her hands aching from emotion. Each stroke stirred up tiny clouds of dust, and each breath tasted like sand. Her son, barely 10, was fanning a weak coal fire in the corner, hoping to bring it back to life. There was no meat, no fish, just enough grain to stretch the meal until tomorrow, maybe. What people don't often talk about when they imagine ancient Egypt is the raw exhaustion. Yes, there were temples. Yes, pyramids. But what about the woman who never once stepped inside a temple? Who had never seen a statue that wasn't cracked, or a wall that wasn't coated in soot? For her, the stories of the gods were more of a warning than a comfort. Ma'at, the goddess of truth and order, was spoken of often, but rarely seen. What order was there when a drought could wipe out everything? Senet's husband, Hapu, worked the river when he could, but boats only needed so many rowers, and nobles only needed so many favors. He'd been gone 3 days now, off with a caravan heading toward a granary to the north. Senet didn't ask too many questions anymore. Men disappeared, came back different, sometimes not at all. It was a silent agreement among the people who lived closest to the floodplain. No questions, no trouble. Up by the royal court, the tension was entirely different, but just as suffocating. Court scribes had been summoned again. Rumors whispered through limestone halls like vipers. Taxes were rising, though nobody dare call it that. The overseers claimed the Nile's last inundation had been weaker than expected. Less grain, less storage. That meant the poor would need to contribute more. But some scribes knew better. One, named Jehutamos, had begun noticing discrepancies in the temple records. Grain wasn't disappearing because of the river. It was disappearing between ledgers. He had no proof, just a hunch. And in ancient Egypt, a hunch could get you buried beneath one of those grand buildings everyone admired. Jehutimos kept his suspicions close, but they burned at him. The gods demanded justice, didn't they? He remembered what his father used to say while teaching him the delicate art of hieratic script. Ink holds truth longer than the tongue. Yet what if the truth made him a target? Meanwhile, trouble stirred along the outer canals where groups of laborers were beginning to murmur more loudly. Food was short, beer rations thinner. One group, once tasked with quarrying limestone for a noble's tomb, had gone days without payment. When they marched to the noble's estate in protest, they were beaten back by guards. No pay, no food, no work. Go home. But what was home? A tent near the canal? A mat under a fig tree? Among these workers was a man named Nebaman, not the scribe whose tomb would one day become famous, but a farmer's son turned stone hauler. He had a limp from a collapsed scaffolding accident and a shoulder that never healed quite right. Yet still he worked. Still he carried loads, trying to feed his aging mother and 3 sisters. One of them, a girl named Mary, had started slipping away during evenings, saying she was praying by the river. But Nebaman knew. Everyone knew what it meant when a girl disappeared too often and came back with her eyes cast down. No one judged her. In times like these, dignity was a luxury. At night, the city groaned. Fires burned low, and the scent of sweat, fear, and drying fish mixed in the air. From the temples came distant chants, priests walking in tight formation, their palms raised to the sky, pleading for the Nile to rise stronger next season. Some believed the gods were angry. Others believed the Pharaoh was hiding something. But nobody spoke too loudly. That's how people vanished. In an underground room carved into an old tomb wall, a group of men and women huddled and whisper. Not rebels. Not yet, but desperate voices with no other option. They had begun documenting things. Who went missing? Who lost food? Who was beaten? Small marks scratched into clay. Silent stories that could not yet be told. A quiet resistance was growing, one that didn't wear armor or carry spears, but clung to memory like a weapon. Back in Wazit, Senet woke in the middle of the night to the sound of feet running past her home. Then voices. Then nothing. She crept outside, holding a dull piece of broken pottery as if it were a knife. A shadow darted past. Then another. Across the alley, she saw Mary, the girl who used to sing while carrying jugs of water, now with blood on her hands and tears streaking her cheeks. Senet didn't ask. She only opened her door and let her in. Mary collapsed onto the floor, trembling. Through broken breaths, she muttered one word. Scribe. Senet said nothing. Just brought her a cloth, dipped in water. The silence between them said more than any question ever could. Something was unraveling. Not in the noble courts, not just in the grain storehouses, but in the streets, in the homes, in the eyes of women who had seen too much and kept too quiet for too long. Jehutimos, unaware of the blood spilled in his name, was at that very moment staring at a piece of papyrus that didn't add up. A single shipment of wheat meant for the temple had been redirected. The seal had been tampered with. But why? And who had the power to do it without the priests noticing? Or had they noticed and said nothing? As he sat in the dim light of his oil lamp, he heard a knock. 3 times. Slow. Intentional. He froze. No one visited at this hour. When he opened the door, no one stood there. Only a roll of linen on the ground, stained red. He picked it up, unrolled it slowly. Inside, a short message written in rushed ink. Asterisk, truth has a price. Choose your gods carefully. Asterisk. Suddenly, the ink on his fingers felt heavier. The quiet behind him deeper. Something old and dangerous was rising in the shadows of ancient Egypt, where gods watched but didn't always speak, and where even scribes had to choose between what was written and what was right. The smell of stale air, mixed with the harsh sun-baked earth, pressed down on every soul working under Pharaoh's rule. For the villagers along the Nile, life didn't flow as peacefully as the river itself. While the great monuments were rising skyward, The people beneath them were crumbling under invisible burdens. This wasn't the picture carved into temple walls or painted onto papyrus scrolls. This was something else entirely. This was the silent suffering no scribe dared record, the true cost of the grandeur of ancient Egypt. Among the many forgotten, there was a farmer named Katie. He was neither a rebel nor a noble, just a quiet man who once believed that the gods watched over him. But as seasons passed and the rains grew more unpredictable, so did Katie's faith. The flood that year had come too strong. What should have brought life instead tore through his village, drowning crops and burying homes under mud. When the waters finally receded, the land looked cursed. And soon after, the tax collectors arrived, not to offer help, but to demand their due. Katie's wife, Epi, tried to comfort him that night, sitting by the small fire with their youngest child asleep in her arms. "Maybe they'll understand," she whispered, but her voice lacked conviction. They both knew that failure to pay grain meant punishment, sometimes as cruel as being dragged to work on royal projects as forced labor. Katie didn't fear death, but he feared being taken far from his family. Still, he couldn't meet the quota. That night, he didn't sleep. He just watched the stars and waited for dawn. In the heart of the capital, where the priests walked in gold-threaded linen and papyrus scrolls were read by oil lamp, the situation was equally tense, but cloaked in ceremony. High priest Mena had begun to suspect something foul among the temple scribes. Grain meant for ritual offerings had been mysteriously disappearing from the storerooms. But no one dared speak too loudly. In a land where gods were believed to shape fate, accusing a fellow priest could be seen as blasphemy, or worse, treason. Mena, a cautious man with a calculating mind, began recording every grain sack's weight by night. By morning, the numbers didn't match. Someone inside the holy sanctuary was stealing food meant for both gods and the Pharaoh himself. The punishment, if caught, would be harsh. But what alarmed Mena more than the theft itself was the motive. Hunger had begun to reach even the sanctified halls of power. The famine, whispered about in marketplaces, had breached the walls of temples too. Outside, across the narrow alleys of the working district, whispers spread like wildfire. People said the gods had turned away, that Pharaoh was cursed, that the stars had changed their path. There were even stories too dangerous to say aloud, of tomb robbers who were secretly state-employed, sent to recover lost gold to pay foreign debts. Truth or fear, no one could say, but the rumors were enough to make the air feel heavier with each passing day. Katie's village was struck again the following week, not by flood or famine this time, but by soldiers. A detachment had come through looking for able-bodied men. No explanations, no time to say goodbye, just spears pointed and choices taken. Katie tried to hide, but his son, barely 12, stood in front of their door with wide eyes. That small act of bravery gave Katie the moment he needed to escape into the reeds by the river. From there, he watched as his neighbors were marched away in silence. The soldier in charge set fire to one of the empty huts before leaving, perhaps as a warning. From the reeds, Katie knew his life was changed. He could not go back, but he couldn't abandon his family either. He would need help. That night, he moved silently under the stars, heading toward the village of Pernemdi, where his cousin Beck had once lived. It was a dangerous journey through unfamiliar paths, but he had no choice. Meanwhile, Epi gathered what little food they had and prepared to leave if needed. The sense of safety in their small home was gone. Back in the capital, High Priest Mena had begun placing watchers within the temple. But what he uncovered wasn't just petty theft, it was systematic. A group of scribes had been diverting grain to the black market, where desperate nobles and merchants were paying high prices to feed their households. Even worse, the scribes weren't acting alone. They had protection from a royal official. Mena now faced a dilemma. If he spoke up, he could be silenced. If he remained quiet, he would be complicit. At the same time, a different kind of unrest was building in Thebes. In the markets, people had begun to chant prayers for justice, not found in temples. A woman named Nefret had gained attention for her bold words. Once a servant in a wealthy estate, she had lost her children during a failed harvest and spoke openly of the failings of the state. Many feared her. Others followed her. She didn't claim to be a prophet, but to many, her voice felt more powerful than any priest's. One morning, Minna heard her speak from a nearby alley while disguised in plain cloth. She spoke of balance, of Ma'at, the central idea that governed Egyptian life, truth, order, and harmony. But she claimed the balance was broken, not by the people, but by those in power. The gods do not turn their backs on us, she said, her voice echoing against the stone walls. They are waiting for us to stand. The priest didn't speak to her. Not yet. But he returned to the temple with something new, an idea that perhaps the old ways were being tested. Perhaps Egypt itself was being asked a question. Could it still uphold the ideals it was built upon? Meanwhile, Katie found Pernembi, or what was left of it. Half the village had been abandoned. Beck was gone, taken by a draft months ago. But a young boy who remembered Beck gave Katie shelter and a warning. They're taking farmers and priests, anyone who knows the land. Something is being built, the boy said, but they don't come back. That night, Katie sat by another unfamiliar fire. The reeds rustled around him, and the stars offered no answers. Across the river, drums echoed faintly, military signals, perhaps, or part of a new ritual. No one could tell anymore. Life in ancient Egypt had once seemed so orderly, so deeply tied to tradition. But now, under the weight of hunger, labor, corruption, and fear, even the old gods seemed silent. Still, something stirred. Not hope exactly, but motion. The kind of shift that comes before the storm. Katie wasn't the only one hiding in the dark. In the capital, among the workers and the priesthood, in distant villages and along the trade routes, people were starting to notice. The pain was no longer silent. The imbalance no longer hidden. And as the great pyramids stood watching under the moonlight, a single truth became clear. This was not the Egypt of carved stone and golden tombs. This was the Egypt of struggle, sacrifice, and survival. And something was coming, something no scroll or monument had prepared them for. The sun, high over the Nile, continued to shine like a ruthless overseer, unblinking and indifferent. In the quiet spaces between flood seasons, the people of ancient Egypt faced a kind of suffering that rarely made its way into the scrolls of priests or the carved reliefs on temple walls. This was the suffering of ordinary people, farmers who bent double in the fields until their backs curved like sickles, mothers who lost children to fevers no one understood, and young men like Beck who, with every passing year, wondered whether freedom was something he would ever touch. Beck was one of the many laborers assigned to the limestone quarries east of the Nile. The rocks here had been carved out for centuries, destined for grand temples and tombs. Kings and nobles had left their marks in towering statues and pyramids, but no one recorded the names of the workers whose hands bled into the stones. Beck's life was carved just as surely into the rock, only not with hieroglyphs, but with calluses and scars. Each morning, he and the others were marched out under armed watch. They would carry chisels and hammers, climbing over sunburnt hills to reach the cliff face. The air was thick with dust. It clung to their skin, filled their mouths, and turned their sweat into a muddy paste. There was no shade, no rest until sundown, and no forgiveness for slowing down. If you collapsed, someone else had to drag your tools so production wouldn't stop. The overseers didn't yell. They didn't need to. One glance from a soldier with a whip was enough to remind everyone what silence cost. But Beck wasn't angry. Not exactly. He had grown up in a small reed village downstream, where his mother used to tell him that anger was a luxury, something the rich had time for. Out here, there was no room for rage, only endurance. Still, something inside him had started to change after the arrival of a new scribe, an outsider named Casa. Unlike most scribes, who came from noble families and rarely spoke to workers, Casa walked among them. He asked questions not just about labor quotas or grain rations, but about their families, their homes, their memories. People were wary at first. Who was this man with soft hands and strange questions? Casa had noticed Beck's quiet strength early on. He started talking to him during the brief meal times, just bread and onions, sharing scraps of news from other regions. Beck listened. He rarely spoke, but he noticed that Casa seemed to be gathering more than just numbers. He was collecting stories, grievances, names. One day, as they sat near a pile of broken stones, Casa leaned closer and whispered something that made Beck freeze. There are others, more than you think. People who are tired, who want change. Beck didn't answer, but his silence was permission enough. That night, after the guards had finished their patrols and the stars settled like quiet witnesses in the sky, Casa came to Beck's shelter. He brought with him a small, rolled piece of linen marked with symbols. It wasn't a message in the traditional sense. The markings were meant to confuse anyone who found them. But Beck had spent enough nights staring at temple walls as a child to understand basic script. What he saw made his pulse quicken. It was a map, crude, yes, but clear. It marked the quarry, the guard posts, the storage pits, and the exit points along the edge of the cliffs. Casa pointed to several areas. We've been tracking their shift rotations, he said quietly. There's a weakness, a 2-hour gap every 5 days when they change patrol patterns. If we move then, we might slip out unnoticed. Beck studied the map. The plan wasn't flawless, but it wasn't fantasy either. And that's when the bigger conflict began, not in the quarry, not in the temple courts, but inside Beck himself. He had spent his life surviving in silence, following rules made by men who would never know hunger or grief. And now, for the first time, he was being asked to risk all of that for something more than survival. For freedom. Freedom was a word people didn't say out loud in ancient Egypt. It wasn't banned, exactly, but it didn't have a place. The pharaoh was everything. Life and death came from the gods, and the pharaoh stood between both. To challenge the system was to challenge the divine. But that's where Casa was different. He didn't believe that the gods cared about who suffered and who ruled. He believed men had built the system, and men could change it. As the days passed, more workers began to join the quiet circle of listeners. Women who cooked for the crews, men who worked the scaffolds, even one of the older guards, an aging veteran who had seen enough death to no longer fear it. Each brought their knowledge, their anger, their dreams. And as the plan grew, so did the risk. Casa warned them all, this isn't just about escaping. It's about exposing the truth. The way you're treated, the lies written on temple walls. If we succeed, others will hear. If we fail, no one will. That was the truth of life in ancient Egypt. The brutality wasn't always in the whip or the hunger. It was in the silence, the stories that were never told, the names that were never carved into walls, the history written only by the winners. Beck began to change. He stopped walking with his head low. He started asking questions, too, about guard rotations, about tool caches, about escape paths. He even managed to slip into the overseer's tent one afternoon and memorize the placement of spare keys. Every small action was a risk, but Beck no longer feared pain. He feared dying with nothing to show for his life except broken fingers and forgotten sweat. Meanwhile, far from the quarry, in a polished court near Memphis, another thread of the story was beginning to unravel. A junior priest named Setep had begun questioning temple records. Grain tallies weren't matching harvest reports. Tools were disappearing from state stores. And whispers were growing among river traders that someone in the eastern quarry was planning something dangerous. Setep wasn't a cruel man, but he had been raised to protect order. He believed in the cycle of Ma'at, balance, justice, harmony. And if rebellion threatened that, it had to be stopped. He sent a sealed message to the governor of the region, warning that a disturbance might be brewing in the labor camps. What he didn't know was that the messenger he entrusted was already part of Cass's network. By the time that scroll reached the governor, the damage had already been done. But Setep's growing curiosity would not end there. He began traveling discreetly, speaking to elders in nearby villages, asking subtle questions about the laborers and any unusual behavior. What he found disturbed him. Old men who once served in Pharaoh's army speaking of injustice. Young women who had lost fathers to forced labor. There was a tension in the air, like the stillness before a storm. Back in the quarry, the clock was ticking. The window Casa had predicted, the 2-hour gap, was approaching in just 5 days. Preparations had to be final. Extra food had been hidden, tools resharpened, routes memorized. Beck took charge of the west flank, responsible for guiding the youngest and oldest down the cliff trail. It was the most dangerous path, steep, narrow, with loose rock, but also the least guarded. But there was one thing they hadn't counted on: a new overseer. On the third day before the planned escape, a man named Tjaru arrived from the capital. Sent by the governor to reinforce order, he brought 20 new guards, each armed, each loyal. He was cruel in a way that didn't require violence. His words did the cutting. He smiled as he announced random floggings. He forced workers to chant praises to the pharaoh before eating, and he suspected something was wrong. Beck noticed immediately: the way Tjaru looked at him, the way he lingered near the food stores, the way two of the new guards kept watch at night, shifting their torches unpredictably. The plan was at risk, and now so were their lives. Beck returned to his shelter that night with his jaw clenched and his palms raw. Casa was already waiting, his face pale. "They know," he said. Beck didn't ask how. He just nodded. And still, neither of them spoke the words neither wanted to believe. It might be too late. The sun refused to let up. Even the Nile seemed to steam as it coiled through the scorched valley. Men with dust-covered backs bent under the weight of stone and silence. One of them, barely a boy, winced as he stumbled forward, arms shaking beneath the carved limestone block. His name was Many, and though he looked only 16, his spine curved like that of an old man. He hadn't spoken in hours. None of them had. It was the law of the overseer: silence until the sun touched the horizon. A whip crack had once broken that rule, and a man's jaw. Life in ancient Egypt was brutal not just because of the work, but because of what it did to your thoughts. Many had learned to stop dreaming. You didn't dream when your father died breaking rocks for Pharaoh's tomb. You didn't dream when the grain was short and the priest still took your last sack to feed statues that couldn't chew. You survived. You learned to lie quietly when the guards walked past. You kept your head down when someone beside you fell and didn't get back up. But beneath the still surface of daily suffering, something stirred. And it wasn't just in Many. Across the river, deep in the palace kitchens, a girl named Citra fought her own quiet war. She was a servant, one of dozens feeding the mouths of those who never lifted anything heavier than a gold cup. Citra had always known how to keep her hands fast and her voice soft. It's how she survived, how her mother had taught her: blend in, clean well, smile small. But lately, she'd started hearing whispers. They came from the guards at night, from the old men drinking sour wine behind the grain storerooms. Rumors of missing children, of priests saying too many prayers at odd hours, of one of the king's advisors gone and nobody asking why. The thing about Egypt in those days wasn't just that it was hard. It was that the wrong people always seemed to vanish. The overseer at the tomb site, a man named Hikanu, had eyes like stones and the patience of someone who enjoyed watching others break. He didn't speak unless he had to, but when he did, his voice snapped through the air like papyrus tearing. One evening, when the sun dipped low and the workers were dragging themselves toward camp, he stopped beside Many. He stared for a long moment, then asked, "Your mother? What's her name?" Many blinked. "Anket," he said. "Still lives?" "Yes." A pause. "Good. Keep working. You lose focus, she loses rations." And just like that, Many understood. Suffering didn't just fall from the sky in Egypt. It had hands and plans. And those plans reached into homes, into mouths, into the thin hope that one day, maybe, just maybe, a boy wouldn't die the same way his father had. At the palace, Citra had her first real reason to worry when she overheard the chief scribe arguing with a guard. They stood outside the storeroom, unaware of her presence behind the shelves. The scribe's voice, usually full of bored pride, now trembled. "They're taking them too often," he hissed. "The temples can't hide it forever." The guard responded sharply. "Do you want to vanish like Meru? Keep your mouth shut." That name, Meru, made Citra's heart freeze. He had been one of the few kind faces among the palace staff. A servant like her, but older, careful, always warning the younger ones to watch their step. And now vanished? Later that night, she found Meru's sandals tucked beneath one of the benches in the rear courtyard. covered in dust. Forgotten. That's when the ache in her chest turned into a knot of dread. Meanwhile, in the tomb camp, Minnie's group unearthed something they weren't supposed to. A chamber sealed by sand and time, far older than the current Pharaoh's plans. It had no markings, no cartouches, just a black stone doorway and a strange pressure in the air that made their skin crawl. Hikanu ordered them to stop and called in a team from the temple. The next day, Minnie and 3 others were told not to speak of what they'd seen. The others nodded. Minnie stared too long. That night, he found half his ration missing and a scratch along the wall near his bed. A single line etched deep and crooked, as though someone had drawn a blade through stone. In Memphis, where Sitra lived, the temples had grown louder in recent weeks. Sacrifices, chants, fires that burned for days. The priest called it a season of purification. But people whispered something else, something older. That the gods were restless. That beneath the Nile, something stirred. That famine might come again. That the pharaoh's silence was not peace, but fear. One morning, the palace awoke to morning cries. A high official had died in his sleep. No signs of illness. No signs of struggle. Just his body, stiff, mouth agape, eyes wide with something that looked like terror. The next day, the priests doubled the offerings. Sitra watched them burn piles of bread and figs, pour honey into the temple basin until it spilled onto the floor. Children wept from hunger while gods were fed with plenty. She began to write things down, secretly, on scraps of linen she'd tucked into the seams of her sleeping mat. Names, dates, rumors, anything. She didn't know why. Maybe it was hope. Maybe it was madness. But she knew something was wrong, and no one else seemed willing to remember it. At the tomb site, things grew worse. Workers began disappearing. Not just dying, vanishing. One man went to relieve himself before dawn and never came back. Another left the quarry line for water and was gone by the time the next man turned around. Hikanu offered no explanation, just threats. Many stopped sleeping. He began to keep track, like Sitra, carving a tally into the back of his bowl. 15 missing. One of them had been his cousin. Then, one evening, Minnie saw something in the distance. Near the sealed black chamber. A figure, dressed not like the others, but in full ceremonial robes. Gold mask. Tall. Still. Watching. It was gone the next second. He tried to tell the others, but they told him to stop. To let it go. That's how you lived in Egypt, by forgetting. In the city, Sitra's list grew. And with it, so did her fear. Her notes now spanned 26 missing servants for strange deaths and a growing pattern of odd temple activity. Still, she had no one to share them with. Trust was a dangerous currency. But the final push came when she returned to her quarters to find everything clean. Too clean. Her mat had been moved. Her storage box disturbed. The linen scraps gone. She was being watched. And just like that, 2 lives, hundreds of miles apart, were connected by silence, fear, and a creeping truth no one dared speak. Something was happening in ancient Egypt. Beneath the chants and the pyramids, behind the grain taxes and the gold masks, a darker current flowed. One that had nothing to do with kings or gods. One that fed on secrets. And soon, both Minnie and Sitra would be forced to choose between obedience and survival. Between silence and truth. Between life as it was and something they couldn't yet name. But the desert never kept secrets forever. It only waited for the wind to rise. In the quiet of the early morning, before the market stirred and the temple drums called the faithful to their morning devotions, a boy named Minnie crept barefoot through the winding back lanes of Thebes. He moved like a shadow, careful not to wake the sleeping dogs or draw the attention of the older boys who guarded their corners like jackals. Minnie wasn't a thief by choice, but when your mother couldn't work and your brothers were gone to the copper mines of Sinai, choices faded into smoke. He reached the riverbank just as the first streaks of dawn colored the Nile. A few boats had already returned from the night's fishing, the air thick with the smell of wet reeds and old wood. Minnie waited by an overturned basket near the dock, where an old fisherman named Kamu sometimes left unwanted scraps. Today, a few small perch glistened in the straw. Minnie whispered a soft thanks, tucked them into his tunic, and hurried off before Kamu or his sons could change their minds. Hunger didn't leave room for pride, not in ancient Egypt. Back in the workers' district, the narrow mud-brick alleys had come alive with movement. Women crouched by hearths shaping loaves for the communal oven. Children fetched water from jars taller than themselves. And men, tired, lean, sun-browned, gathered their tools for another brutal day under the lash of the overseers. Many slipped through them, his eyes always moving, always watching. His friend Hori waved from a rooftop, his fingers white with plaster. "The priest's house needs patching again," Hori called. "Come by later if you want some bread." Many nodded but didn't answer. His mother would be waiting. He climbed the broken steps to their small home, ducking under a low beam and stepping into the room where the heat clung thick and the air smelled of old linen and sweat. She sat on a reed mat in the corner, weaving rushes with fingers that trembled from age and sickness. When she saw him, she smiled faintly, her lips cracked and eyes ringed with shadows. He placed a perch beside her mat. "You're a good boy," she whispered, touching his face with rough hands. The gods see, but Minnie wasn't so sure anymore. The gods of ancient Egypt, Osiris, Anubis, Are, seemed distant, far too occupied with the fates of pharaohs and priests to worry about a sick woman and her skinny son. Still, it comforted her to believe, so he didn't say anything. He just sat beside her as she cleaned the fish, humming a lullaby she used to sing when he was smaller. Meanwhile, in a palace just beyond the worker's edge, the high priest Nesseman stood beneath a columned hall, flanked by guards in gold-trimmed skirts. He spoke in hushed tones to a royal scribe, his brow creased. "The numbers don't match," Nesseman said. "Grain shipments are short. Silver has gone missing, and I have it on good word that laborers are planning to strike." The scribe's face tightened. "Again? After what happened last time?" Nesseman nodded grimly. "This time it's worse. They say one of the overseers was caught stealing temple offerings. A boy saw it, and word spread." The scribe lowered his voice. "If that gets out to the nobles—" "It won't," the priest interrupted. "We'll find the boy, silence him if we must. Order must be kept, far from the polished halls of the temple." Many sat with Hori later that day, watching as the older boy slapped clay onto the side of a crumbling wall. "You ever wonder," Hori said, pausing for breath, "if the gods know what goes on down here?" Many shrugged. "I think they're too busy with the rich to care." Hori laughed, bitter. "Maybe that's why the dead need gold in their tombs, to bribe the gods into noticing them." The two boys worked in silence for a while, and then Minnie spoke quietly. "I saw something. A few nights ago, near the temple granary." Hori stopped mid-motion. "What did you see?" "There was an overseer. He had a sack. Took it from the back of the storehouse. It clinked, like coins or metal." "You sure?" "I heard him mutter, 'Too good for the priests. Let them pray for gold if they want it.'" Then he walked off. Hori's face went pale. "Minnie, if anyone knows you saw that—" "I didn't tell anyone," Minnie said quickly. "But it's wrong. People are starving. My mother, she hasn't eaten in 2 days. And they're stealing. You want justice?" "In Egypt," Hori spat into the dirt, "justice is for those who can afford amulets and pay the scribes. For people like us, we survive." But Minnie couldn't let it go. That night, lying beside his mother in their sweltering room, he kept thinking of the overseer's face, the smug curve of his mouth. He thought of the empty bowls, of his mother's slow, shallow breaths. He thought of the gods, and how they weighed hearts against feathers in the afterlife. What about justice now in this life? 2 days later, he returned to the granary at dusk, hiding in the tall reeds near the back wall. He waited, and just before the sun dipped behind the hills, he saw him, Kapu, the overseer, a thick-necked man with a limp and a scar across his jaw. Kapu looked both ways, then slipped inside. When he came out, he was carrying another sack. Many watched every step, committing it to memory. But what he didn't see was the shadow behind him. Another figure had been watching, one that had followed many from the roof of the priest's house. And now, the watcher had seen enough. That night, Minnie returned home to find their door open. His mother was asleep, or maybe not. She didn't stir when he called her name. He stepped inside, heart pounding. The room had been searched, roughly, their few possessions scattered. The fish basket overturned, his mother's loom broken. Then he saw it, A mark on the wall in red paint. A crude symbol of a jackal. The mark of the palace guards. A warning. Minnie backed out slowly. He knew what it meant. Someone knew what he'd seen. He ran. Through the alley. Past the baker's stall. Through the half-ruined garden of the scribe's villa. He didn't stop until he reached the edge of the desert, where the stars seemed to breathe in the silence. His thoughts raced. If they were willing to threaten his mother, what else would they do? Back in the city, Nessimon paced beneath the temple's sacred fig tree. "The boy is clever," one of the guards said. "But we've left the mark. He'll run." "Let him," Nessimon muttered. "We'll draw him out." The people love their little hero stories. But when the hero disappears, they forget. The scribe beside him looked uneasy. "If word spreads too far, we'll need to answer." "We answer only to Pharaoh," Nessimon replied, voice cold. "And Pharaoh has bigger concerns than a child from the slums." But the city didn't forget. Not entirely. Whispers started. About a boy who saw something forbidden. About an old woman who was beaten for no reason. About guards who left marks like curses. And in the shadows of the sandstone walls, behind the laughter of the beer sellers and the music of the reed flutes, something ancient stirred. Justice didn't come quickly in ancient Egypt, not for the poor. But sometimes it came from the least expected places. And Minnie, skinny, barefoot, heart burning with fire, wasn't done yet. He had seen the truth. And if the gods wouldn't intervene, he would have to do it himself. But someone else had seen the truth too. Someone far more dangerous. The Nile's floodwaters had finally receded, leaving behind cracked mud beds and restless silence. What should have been a season of rebirth now felt uncertain, almost cursed. The harvest had been meager, and people whispered that the gods were angry. The scribes, once content to quietly record taxes and temple offerings, now found themselves bombarded with questions from every corner of the city. Even the high priests were tense, offering sacrifices with trembling hands, their words hollow, like they too feared something they couldn't name. Isara, the old water carrier who everyone in the neighborhood knew and trusted, stopped showing up. His sandals were found near the eastern canal, half buried in clay, but his body was never recovered. Some said he was dragged into the reeds by crocodiles. Others swore they saw strange lights near the riverbank the night he vanished. Lights that floated, pulsed, and then disappeared. These stories should have been dismissed as drunken gossip. But they weren't. Not this time. In the workshops where men shaped stone and copper, arguments started to break out over small things. Who took too long at the kiln? Who left a tool out in the sun? There was an edge to everyone now. A blacksmith's apprentice swore he saw a jackal walk into a shadow and vanish. A grain measurer claimed she touched a jar and saw a vision of blood. These things would have seemed absurd a month ago. Now, people just nodded and looked away. Maya had grown more withdrawn. She no longer sat by the river in the evenings. She stayed indoors, eyes fixed on the small wooden statue of Batet her mother had passed down to her. She whispered to it, though her voice carried the sadness of someone no longer sure she was being heard. Her father tried to pretend nothing had changed, but she heard him pacing at night, heard his quiet prayers slip into panicked murmurs. Even the cats that once lounged lazily around their home seemed uneasy, hissing at empty doorways or vanishing for days at a time. Rumors began to swirl about a forbidden scroll, one hidden beneath the library at the Temple of Thoth. It was said to contain knowledge not meant for mortal minds, the kind of knowledge that could either save Egypt or doom it forever. The scroll had been locked away generations ago, sealed beneath a stone slab marked with a warning. He who reads forgets the light. Kemet, a former student of the temple and one of the youngest scribes ever trained, had always been curious about it. He used to sneak down to the lowest chambers, try to find hints in the carvings. But when he'd last mentioned the scroll to his mentor, the old priest had gone deathly pale, grabbed his wrist, and whispered, "Do not speak of that again. You don't know what listens when you do." Kemet hadn't brought it up since. Until now. As things worsened, Kemet found his thoughts drifting back to that forbidden place. What if there was a reason things were unraveling? What if the answers were locked beneath that stone slab? What if someone else was already down there? He didn't want to go looking for trouble, But it was hard to sleep when your entire world was starting to feel like a riddle you didn't know how to solve. Meanwhile, deep in the workers' district near the edge of the city, another story was beginning. A man named Haru, once a respected architect who had overseen some of the grandest tombs in the Valley of the Kings, had returned after years of self-imposed exile. His face was more lined, his speech more cautious. He claimed he had seen something during his last commission that had broken him. He refused to speak of it directly. All he said was, "We built a doorway, and something walked through it." Haru spent his days carving protective sigils into the walls of his modest home, muttering names of forgotten deities. He avoided temples, avoided the river. Some said he wore a small stone amulet under his tunic that glowed faintly in the dark. And still the sun rose. The people went about their lives. They farmed. They bargained. They prayed. But underneath everything was that feeling something was coming. And they didn't know if it would come from the desert, the river, or their own hearts. The royal court, too, had started to shift. The Pharaoh's advisors whispered behind closed doors about the omens stacking up like bricks in a tomb. His youngest daughter, said to be gifted with visions, had fallen into a strange sleep, neither dead nor truly alive. Her body was preserved and fed in silence, but her eyes no longer blinked, and her lips sometimes moved as though reciting something only she could hear. The physicians were baffled. The priests were terrified. And the Pharaoh, though outwardly calm, had ordered a full lockdown of the inner palace. One night, in the court's archive, a fire broke out. It burned only one section of scrolls, those dealing with astronomy and celestial rituals. The fire was contained quickly, but the message was clear to those who noticed. Someone wanted specific knowledge erased. Someone who didn't want Egypt to remember the last time the river went silent. And it was then that Maya received the letter. Delivered by a blind courier who didn't speak, the parchment was worn and faintly stained. Inside, written in a hurried, crooked hand, were 3 lines. "You are not wrong to be afraid. The veil is thinning. Seek the boy who doesn't dream." She read the letter a dozen times, then burned it. But she couldn't forget the last line. A boy who doesn't dream? Who was he? Was he real? And why did they think she would know how to find him? Maya didn't tell her father. She didn't tell anyone. But something inside her clicked, like the stone lid of a sarcophagus sliding back. She packed a small satchel with bread, an obsidian knife, and her mother's statue of Batet. Then she left. No destination. No map. Just a name written in her mind. The boy who doesn't dream. And far away, beyond the city walls, in a small desert settlement where the wind carried strange smells and the stars never looked the same twice, a boy sat on a roof watching the sky. He didn't blink. He didn't move. And he hadn't closed his eyes in over 7 years. They say the Nile gave life, but it also quietly took it away. As the river's gentle ripples brushed against the edge of the fields, the lives of thousands of Egyptians depended on its moods. Floods too high meant death. Floods too low meant famine. In the heart of this delicate balance was Minna, a low-ranking scribe in the city of Wazit, known today as Luxor. His job was to tally grain, record harvests, and translate the will of the pharaoh into numbers and quotas. But lately, those numbers had stopped adding up. The people whispered about something they didn't dare say aloud. The grain was vanishing. Stores were being emptied far faster than they could be filled. Yet the ledger showed everything was intact. Minna, no one of particular fame or power, found himself buried in conflicting scrolls and secretive glances from fellow scribes. And one thing had become clear: someone high up was falsifying records. But Minna couldn't speak openly. In ancient Egypt, questioning the system wasn't just dangerous, it was a death sentence. Every statue, every inscription, every monument was a reminder of who ruled and who obeyed. Pharaohs were seen as gods in the flesh. To challenge their system, even by exposing corruption among their officials, was to invite the wrath of heaven and earth. While Minna quietly struggled with his discovery, across the city in a small village just beyond the palace walls, an older woman named Set tended to her dying husband. He had been a stonemason all his life. one of the thousands who carved the temples and obelisks, now standing tall in honor of gods he'd never seen. His hands were blistered and twisted, ruined by decades of chipping stone under the desert sun. And now, with no savings, no food left in storage, and priests demanding payment for healing rituals, Aset could do nothing but watch him wither. Each time she passed the gates of the royal granary, she saw guards laughing with full bellies, while mothers in her neighborhood fought over scraps. The cruel imbalance didn't surprise her anymore. It just hardened her heart. Life in ancient Egypt, for people like her, wasn't about building pyramids or praising gods. It was about survival, about choosing whether to bribe a priest or feed a child, about carrying water every day in broken sandals until your knees gave out. But Aset had a son, KB, and that changed everything. KB was young, sharp-eyed, and far too curious for his own good. He had a knack for slipping in and out of places unnoticed, something Minna would come to learn very soon. When Minna visited the village to tally grain rations, he noticed KB watching him. Unlike the others who averted their gaze, this boy stared directly at him, as if trying to read the truth from his face. And Minna, already suspicious of everything around him, didn't look away. Later that day, Minna found a tiny note tucked beneath the scrolls. It was crudely written, barely literate, but the message was chilling. I saw them take it. At night. From a storeroom. I can show you. Minna was no hero, but something in him snapped. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was guilt. Or maybe, just maybe, it was the gnawing feeling that if this system was allowed to go on, the entire structure of their society, built on lies, would eventually collapse. That night, Minna crept through the quiet back alleys of Wazit, led by KB's small, bare feet. They avoided the torches, skirted the watchmen, and slipped into the grain storage chambers. Inside, Minna saw it with his own eyes. The sealed jars marked with a royal symbol, each labeled as full, were light. Some were empty, and others, strangely, were filled with sand, sealed with the same wax insignia. The deception wasn't an accident. It was a plan. Minna reached for one of the wax seals and paused. It bore the name of a high priest. Not just any official, one of Pharaoh's own circle. The corruption didn't stop with lowly guards or greedy farmers. It had clawed its way to the top. That's when he heard a soft noise. A scrape. A breath. KB ducked behind a column, pulling Minna with him just as a lantern's glow lit up the room. Two men entered, one in the robes of the temple, the other a royal guard. They spoke in hushed tones, but the message was clear. More grain was to be diverted. A caravan would leave by dawn, hidden under cloths, marked as temple offerings. Minna gripped the boy's shoulder. They had stumbled into something far bigger than theft. This was systemic looting, carried out in the name of the gods. Back in the village, Aset waited with worry tightening her chest. She had no idea where her son had gone. If anything happened to him, if the priests or guards caught him spying, she knew she would never see him again. But even if he returned, what then? Speak out and be silenced, or stay quiet and keep suffering. Life in ancient Egypt wasn't just hard because of the heat or labor. It was hard because the truth had nowhere to live. While pharaohs built massive tombs to carry them into the afterlife, families like Aset's struggled to survive the next sunrise. Scribes like Minna were taught to worship order, but they weren't taught how to challenge it when the system itself became the weapon. And children like KB, full of fire and questions, learned early that curiosity could kill faster than disease. Yet, something had changed. Minna couldn't go back to his desk and pretend the numbers made sense. He couldn't ignore the sand-filled jars, the starving villages, the whispers in the temple hallways. He had to make a choice. Not a dramatic, world-changing choice, but a quiet, personal one. Would he keep writing lies? Or would he try to expose them? He didn't have a plan. He had no allies. Just a village boy with a sharp mind, and a mother whose strength was born from years of loss. So the next day, under the scorching Egyptian sun, Minna returned to the palace. He carried his scrolls, his ink, his usual tired expression. But hidden in his sleeve was something new, a tiny scrap of linen. It bore a duplicate seal of the royal priest's wax mark, pressed into clay and copied during the night. A clue, a risk, a start. He knew what he was doing could cost him everything. But he also knew this. If they all kept pretending, nothing would ever change. The sand would keep filling the jars. The priests would keep their power. And the people, his people, would keep dying in silence. And so the cracks in the mighty walls of Egypt's golden age began to form. Not through war, but through whispers, through stolen glances and broken seals, through the choices of the forgotten, the unseen, the ordinary. But the question still lingered. How far would those whispers travel? And who else was listening? Beneath the orange twilight of a Nile dusk, something shifted in the air around the worksite at Thebes. The breeze that carried sand and incense also carried whispers now, soft like the brush of linen, but heavy like the weight of secrets. Rhea, shoulders burnt from the sun and hands blistered from hauling stone, noticed it before the others. He paused mid-step, his body still aching from weeks of back-breaking labor, but his ears tuned toward the murmur rising among the workers. Word had trickled down from the overseers, hushed at first, then quickly catching like a spark in dry grass. A tomb had been broken into. Not just any tomb, but one believed to be protected by sacred curses, and its breach was nothing short of unthinkable. It wasn't the act of robbery that stunned people most. It was the implication that someone from among their own ranks had played a part. For Rhea, the thought sent a chill crawling down his spine. In a place where everyone worked shoulder to shoulder, the idea of betrayal clung to the skin like desert sweat. KB, the stone carver who often sang old folk songs while chiseling, had suddenly gone quiet that morning. He didn't show up to his section. By mid-afternoon, his tools still lay where he'd last used them. A mason claimed to have seen him arguing with a scribe near the royal supply tent 2 nights prior. A scribe, no less. One of the few who could read and write, who tracked every measure of grain, copper, and chisel blade. The educated were supposed to be the trusted ones. Now they too were part of the suspicion. That night, Rhea and a few others sat near a dying fire pit, their dried lentil stew forgotten as they spoke in hushed voices. The youngest among them, Hapu, asked the question no one wanted to answer. What happens if they think it's us? If they don't find who did it? Silence hung heavy. Rhea didn't know the exact answer, but he knew enough from stories passed down. In ancient Egypt, crimes against the dead weren't simply punished by law. They were cursed by the gods themselves. The penalty wasn't only death. It was erasure. No name carved, no tomb blessed, no soul passed into the field of reeds. It was eternal nothingness. By the 3rd day, royal guard had arrived. Not the ones who marched ceremonially through the city, but men from the inner court, cloaked in fine linen, their eyes sharp and cold. They brought with them a priest from the house of life and a scroll sealed in wax. That night, under torchlight, the scroll was read aloud. It wasn't a decree, but a ritual inventory of what had been taken. A scarab amulet, 2 jars of sacred oil, and a single golden feather, said to represent Maat, the goddess of truth. Rhea recognized the items, not because he had seen them, but because one of the older builders had once described them in great detail, back when stories were shared to pass long hours. Those relics weren't just decorative. They were part of something older, linked to a pharaoh who died without an heir, whose tomb had been sealed twice, once by hand and again by superstition. The guards questioned everyone. They asked where each man slept, where he ate, who he spoke with. Rhea answered carefully, but not falsely. He had nothing to hide, or so he thought, until one of the guards stopped him mid-sentence. "You worked near the stone markers last week," the man said. "Yes," Rhea replied. "Did you see anything out of place? Or anyone?" Rhea hesitated. He had seen something, a faint light flickering near the edge of the cliffs just before dawn 2 mornings ago. But he hadn't thought much of it. Fires sometimes flared from travelers or herders in the distance. "I thought it was shepherds," he finally said. The guard's eyes narrowed. "No herders this close to the necropolis. That land is sacred." Later that night, Rhea walked alone down toward the riverbank. The moon rippled on the surface like silver. He needed air, space, clarity. And then he saw her, Nera, the priestess's assistant. She stood barefoot at the edge of the water, looking out as if waiting for something. Or someone. "You shouldn't be out here alone," Reyes said, stepping closer. Neither startled nor surprised. She turned slowly. "Neither should you." They stood in silence. Then she spoke, voice low. "You saw the light on the cliff, didn't you?" Rhea's heart raced. "How did you?" "I was there too," she said. "I saw him." "Him who?" She paused. "The scribe. Menon." Rhea froze. Menon had always seemed quiet, devoted to his scrolls and ink, rarely speaking above a whisper. But appearances often meant little here. She explained that she'd followed him after noticing strange markings being added to the grain records. Extra rations where there shouldn't be, symbols that weren't part of temple script. She believed he was using his knowledge of old rituals to access tombs undetected. But why? For gold? Rhea asked. No, for something else. Something he said would make him eternal. Her words sent a tremor through Rhea's gut. Not eternal in story or memory. Eternal in life. It was madness, chasing immortality in the land of the dead. Suddenly, a rustling in the reeds. Rhea stepped forward, shielding Nera instinctively. A shadow moved fast, then stopped. Menon stepped into the moonlight, calm, hands empty. "I wonder when you'd find me," he said. Rhea tensed. "You broke the tomb. You stole from the gods. I preserve what others would let rot in the sand," Menon said. "The amulet, the oil, the feather, they are more than symbols. They are formulas. And I was so close." Nera's voice was steady. "You risked the lives of every worker here. The wrath of gods isn't just legend. I didn't believe in wrath. Until now." Behind them, more guards appeared, spears drawn, faces grim. Someone had followed Rhea. Or perhaps Menon had allowed this ending. He didn't resist when they took him. Back at the camp, the priest declared the stolen items tainted. They would not be returned to the tomb. Instead, they would be sealed deep beneath the river, far from temple grounds, never to be touched again. The workers were silent for days. Life resumed, but something had changed. Not just in Rhea, but in all of them. The illusion that ancient Egypt was purely a land of order and glory had been peeled away, showing something far more human beneath it all. Fear, ambition, betrayal. And yet, the sun still rose. The stones still needed lifting. But sometimes, when Rhea walked past the cliffs at dawn, he imagined he saw a flicker of light in the distance. Not fire, not a torch, just the echo of something ancient that refused to be forgotten. The Nile was calm again, its surface catching the final gold of the setting sun. Farmers were returning from the fields, their backs sore, but their minds at peace, for the flood had been kind this year. Menon stood beside the old sycamore tree outside his home, watching the water slowly glide past, carrying with it the pain of the past few weeks. The trial of life in ancient Egypt never truly ended, but for now, the weight had lifted. His son, Sephu, sat beside him quietly, peeling dates into a clay bowl. The boy had asked many questions since the disappearance of the overseer. They all had. Whispers of a noble's misdeeds still lingered in the market stalls. The guards no longer asked questions. The scribes had moved on. But the truth stayed close, known in fragments to those who had lived it. Menon never spoke it aloud. Some stories were too dangerous, too raw. Others didn't need to be spoken. They were etched into the faces of those who'd survived. In the village, people had begun to return to their daily rhythms. The potter's wheel sang again. Children's laughter echoed down the dusty alleys. But something subtle had changed. The fear that once hung over them, the pressure of constant surveillance and blind obedience to those in power, had cracked. Not shattered, but cracked. And through that crack, the people had glimpsed something fragile. Hope. The old woman, Hetepti, had not left her hut for days, recovering from the injuries she'd suffered in the confrontation near the river. Menon had visited her with honey and balm, kneeling at her side in silence. Her eyes had flickered open, and with a weak smile, she had said, "The gods see everything, even when men pretend not to." He believed her. Further north, The priests had declared an auspicious reading from the stars, proclaiming a season of renewal. Offerings at the temples grew, incense burned in thick clouds, and even the Pharaoh's messengers brought news of reforms. New rules for the overseers, inspections by royal scribes, rights reinforced for land workers. Whether these changes were real or merely spoken for calm, no one knew. But the announcement had stirred a ripple of justice through the kingdom. Nefret, the widow whose complaints had been the first spark of the conflict, was now visited regularly by villagers bringing gifts, bread, barley, help with her son's fishing net. She had not asked for kindness, but she had earned their respect. People looked at her differently now. Her story was known. Her voice had mattered. That was rare. In a nearby settlement, a new overseer had been appointed. Young, lean, and uncertain, he had already been seen helping villagers lift water jars and asking about their daily struggles. Some called it strategy, others called it fear. Either way, the people watched him cautiously. They had learned not to forget how quickly power could twist a man. One afternoon, Minna found himself back at the site of the granary where it had all begun. The stone steps still bore scuff marks from sandals. The gate was reinforced now, guarded by two men who didn't look interested in cruelty. A scribe passed by, nodding to Minna, recognizing him. Nothing was said, but something was shared in that brief look, a memory, a truth unspoken but understood. As the harvest neared, the workers moved in rhythm again. Fields were tended with care. Tools were sharpened. Songs returned to the morning air. They were not songs of joy, not yet, but songs of endurance, of survival, of life moving forward. And in the evenings, beneath the stars, parents told their children different kinds of stories, not just of gods and pharaohs, but of real people, neighbors who stood up, women who didn't back down, men who risked punishment to protect the weak. Stories that didn't make it to the stone carvings, but stayed alive in the hearts of those who heard them. One night, Sephu turned to his father as they walked along the river and asked, "Will it ever be fair, truly fair?" Minna didn't answer right away. He bent down, scooped a handful of water from the Nile, and let it pour through his fingers. "Fairness," he finally said, "is like this river. It flows, then it dries, then it floods again, but it always comes back. What matters is that we stay standing until it does." Sephi nodded, quietly holding his father's hand. Elsewhere in the kingdom, the grand tombs continued to rise. The rich still dined on roast duck and figs. Slaves still hauled stones under the sun. The gods still watched from their altars. Life was still brutal in ancient Egypt. But within that brutality, there were small rebellions of kindness, quiet moments of justice, brief glimmers of change. No one knew if those moments would last. But for now, in this small stretch of land by the Nile, they had made a mark. A soft one, but real. Years later, the names would be forgotten. The records would not mention the struggle, the loss, the courage. But Sephi would remember. And one day, he would tell his own children about a time when people stood together, not because they were brave, but because they were tired of being afraid. In the world of temples and tyranny, sometimes the loudest act of defiance was simply refusing to break. And in the silence of that final night, as the stars blinked down upon a sleeping village, the Nile kept moving, just like the people who lived beside it, quietly enduring, always hoping. The story of ancient Egypt is filled with grand kings, powerful gods, and towering monuments. But its real story, the human story, is one of struggle, survival, and silent strength. That's the part we often forget. And maybe that's the part that matters most.